The father placed a camera inside his deceased daughter's coffin out of overwhelming grief and longing for her. Late at night, when he turned on the camera, he was completely shocked to hear cries for help. Daniel Howard leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the line of houses across the street. His prosthetic leg rested stiffly on the worn edge of the oak desk. The hum of the neighborhood was distant, muffled by the quiet hum of the house. His fingers traced the faint scar that ran along his forearm, a habit he'd developed since the accident. "They called me a hero," he muttered to himself, the words bitter as they slipped past his lips. What do heroes do when the fight's gone? The answer to that had been the cornerstone of his life after the army. Retirement wasn't supposed to come this early, not in his prime, not with so much left to give. But the blast, the searing pain, and the sight of his leg torn away had made the decision for him. He had returned home a different man, not just in body, but in spirit. He hadn't let it stop him, though. If there was one thing the military taught him, it was how to pivot. The move to real estate had been a gamble. Daniel chuckled at the memory of Grace's raised eyebrows when he'd told her his plan. She hadn't believed it would work. "That's a risky business, Daniel," she'd said, brushing her auburn hair behind her ear. "You think you can just jump into it and start making deals? This isn't a battlefield." Grace had always been practical, her words sharp but not entirely unsupportive back then. She was the kind of woman who liked security, stability. Daniel had provided that for her until he couldn't. But the gamble paid off. Within 3 years, he'd gone from struggling to sell his first property to close in million-dollar deals. His bank account swelled, and their lifestyle followed suit. Grace seemed to enjoy that part of his success. Her smile grew brighter at dinner parties when she mentioned her husband's investments. Her hand found his arm more often in public, her voice a touch sweeter when she introduced herself as Mrs. Howard. Yet, in the quiet moments behind the closed doors of their sprawling home, she was colder than ever. "Daniel," she had once said during one of those quiet moments, "you've done so much. Don't you think it's time to slow down?" He'd been sitting on their leather couch flipping through a stack of property listings. He looked up at her, confused by her tone, soft but distant. She was standing by the fireplace, her reflection flickering in the glass as the flames danced. "Slow down," he asked. "Grace, this is what I've worked for. I thought you'd be proud." Her lips curled into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am. It's just, sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. You're always so busy." He frowned, studying her face. She wasn't the woman he remembered marrying. The vibrant, laughing Grace who'd kissed him under the fireworks on the 4th of July. This Grace was harder to read, her warmth replaced by a practiced poise that felt more suited for social events than private moments. He'd brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to stress. But the signs were there, and if Daniel were being honest, he'd seen them. The glances that lingered too long on his prosthetic leg, the way her hand would twitch, as if resisting the urge to pull away when he reached for her. The nights she excused herself to bed early, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Even her words began to cut deeper, though they were always wrapped in a polite veneer. She stopped calling him Danny, the nickname she'd used in their younger days, and reverted to Daniel, as though he were a stranger she'd met at a fundraiser. Still, he clung to the idea of her love like a lifeline. He told himself it was just a phase, that they'd get through it like they had everything else. The accident had been hard on both of them. Surely that was all it was. People changed under pressure, didn't they? He believed in her even when she stopped believing in him. The truth was simpler than Daniel wanted to admit. Grace wasn't in love with the man he'd become. She loved the soldier, the one who stood tall and strong in uniform, the one who didn't need help tying his boots in the morning or adjusting his prosthetic leg when it pinched. The moment he came home less than whole, he'd lost something in her eyes. But Daniel was blind to it, or maybe he just refused to see. He worked harder, bought her expensive jewelry, surprised her with weekend getaways. He believed that if he gave her enough, he could fill the void that had grown between them. Daniel sat at the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that made the air feel thick and heavy. Grace stood by the kitchen counter, her arms folded across her chest. She hadn't said a word for the past 5 minutes, and the silence between them was beginning to feel unbearable. Finally, she spoke, her voice clipped and laced with irritation. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Daniel looked up at her, his jaw tightening. "Grace, it's not about being serious. It's about doing the right thing." Grace rolled her eyes, a small scoff escaping her lips. "The right thing?" she repeated mockingly, as if the concept itself was laughable. "You've barely even talked to me about this, Daniel. You just decided on your own, didn't you?" He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I didn't decide on my own. I made a promise, Grace, to Harry. You remember Harry, don't you? The man who saved my life more than once, who trusted me enough to ask me to take care of his daughter if something ever happened to him." Grace shifted her weight, looking away. She hated when Daniel used his past like a weapon, wielding it to justify decisions she didn't agree with. "Of course, I remember Harry," she said, her tone softer but still guarded. "But taking in a child, Daniel, that's not something you just do. We don't have kids for a reason. Our life doesn't have room for that kind of complication." "It's not a complication," Daniel shot back, his voice firm. "She's a little girl. She's 4 years old, Grace, and she's got no one else." Grace pressed her lips together, her expression unreadable. He could tell she was weighing her words carefully, trying to find a way to argue without making herself look heartless. "You've thought about how this changes everything for us, haven't you?" she asked finally. "Our freedom, our privacy. You're bringing someone else into our lives, into our home. It's not just about her, Daniel. It's about us." For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. He could feel the familiar ache in his chest, the one that always crept up during these conversations. Grace had a way of framing everything in terms of what it cost her, as if love was some kind of ledger she needed to keep balanced. "I've thought about it," he said quietly. "And I've made my decision. I'm bringing her here." The adoption process moved faster than he'd expected. A few weeks later, Violet was standing in their living room, clutching a small, tattered suitcase with both hands. Her big brown eyes scanned the room nervously, her posture stiff, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Daniel knelt down in front of her, his voice gentle. "Hi, Violet. I'm Daniel. You can call me whatever you'd like. And, this here," he gestured toward Grace, who stood awkwardly by the stairs, "is Grace. She's going to be your mom." The word mom hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Grace smiled thinly, her lips stretching just enough to pass as welcoming. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice overly sweet. "We're so glad you're here." Violet nodded shyly but didn't say a word. Daniel saw the flicker of unease in the little girl's eyes, and it broke his heart. He reached out and took her suitcase. "Why don't I show you your room, huh?" We've got it all set up for you." As they walked up the stairs, Daniel glanced back at Grace. She was still standing by the stairs, her smile gone the moment Violet wasn't looking. Violet settled in quickly, or at least Daniel thought so. She was quiet and well-behaved, never causing a fuss. She spent hours in her room with the toys Daniel had bought her, playing quietly by herself. But Grace noticed other things. She noticed the way Violet clung to Daniel, how her face lit up whenever he entered the room. She noticed how Daniel's attention shifted, how he no longer asked Grace if she wanted to go out to dinner or brought her flowers without a reason. Everything was about Violet now. "She's sweet," Grace said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. Her voice had the same artificial lilt it always carried when she talked about the girl. "But don't you think you're spoiling her a bit?" Daniel frowned. "Spoiling her?" "Grace, I'm just trying to make her feel at home." "Right," Grace said, swirling her wine glass. "But you don't think she's getting too attached? I mean, what happens when she starts thinking of you as her father?" "I am her father," Daniel said, his tone sharp. Grace's eyes flickered with irritation. She took a slow sip of wine before responding. "Of course you are. I just meant it's a big adjustment for all of us. I hope you're prepared for how much this changes things." Daniel didn't reply. He was beginning to realize that Grace didn't want things to change at all. Daniel couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it started feeling like he was living with a stranger, but the house didn't feel the same anymore. Grace was always there, always moving, always watching, yet her presence seemed colder now, like the way sunlight could glance off a frozen lake without ever warming it. Violet, unaware of the quiet tensions growing around her, was blooming under his care. Her laughter, soft and shy at first, now rang out as she played in the yard or told him about her day. Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how resilient she was, given everything she'd been through. But every time she looked toward Grace, seeking approval or even a smile, she was met with indifference. Sometimes worse. "Grace," he said one evening after dinner, as Violet was upstairs coloring. "Can we talk?" She didn't look up from her phone. "About what?" Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's about Violet. She's trying so hard to connect with you, and it's like you're shutting her out." Grace finally glanced up, her expression unreadable. "I'm doing my best, Daniel," she said coolly. "It's not like I asked for this situation." He felt his jaw tighten. "She's just a kid, Grace. She's been through so much already. Can't you at least try to make her feel welcome?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't lecture me, Daniel. I didn't sign up for this. You brought her here without even thinking about how it would affect us." "I thought we were a team," he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I thought you'd understand why this was important." "A team?" Grace laughed bitterly. "You mean you made a decision and I'm supposed to just go along with it? That's what you think a team is?" He stared at her, stunned by her sharpness. Grace had always been firm, opinionated, but this was different. This wasn't just frustration, it was disdain. The days following that argument were quiet but heavy, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Grace's efforts to maintain appearances became more polished, almost performative. She'd offer Violet a stiff smile or a half-hearted compliment when Daniel was around, but the moment his back was turned, her veneer would crack. One afternoon, as Daniel worked in his home office, Violet came running in, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her small frame trembling. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling down to her level. She hesitated, looking back toward the hallway. I tried to show Mummy my drawing, she whispered, her voice breaking. She said she was too busy. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He pulled her into a hug, her little body fitting perfectly against his. It's okay, Violet, he murmured. I'll look at it. Let's see what you've got. As she smiled faintly and ran off to grab her drawing, Daniel stood and leaned against his desk, his hands gripping the edge. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Grace wasn't just struggling to connect, she was actively pushing Violet away. Later that evening, after Violet was asleep, Daniel confronted Grace again. This time, he was less cautious, less willing to dance around her feelings. She came to me crying today, he said without preamble, because you brushed her off. Grace, who had been flipping through a magazine, didn't even look up. She needs to learn that not everyone has time to cater to her. Daniel's voice hardened. She's not asking to be catered to, Grace. She's asking for a little kindness. And what about me? She snapped, finally meeting his gaze. When's the last time you even thought about how all of this affects me? Do you think it's easy, having a child suddenly thrown into your life? One you didn't even want. The words hit him like a slap, but they also crystallized everything he'd been trying to ignore. I didn't think I'd have to convince you to care about a little girl who's been through hell, he said quietly. But I guess I was wrong. Her face darkened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she stood and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the echoes of his own words. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into making Violet feel at home. He took her to the park, helped her pick out books at the library, and taught her how to ride a bike. Every small victory, a laugh, a hug, the way she called him Daddy, felt like a triumph, a reminder that he was doing something right. But with every moment of joy he shared with Violet, he could feel Grace pulling further away. She barely spoke to him now except when necessary, and her smiles had become rare and hollow. Still, he hoped. He hoped that time would heal whatever was broken, that Grace would come around. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the growing weight in his chest, the sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. The house had grown quieter over the past few weeks, but it wasn't a comforting quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on everything. Daniel found himself clinging more tightly to the small moments of happiness Violet brought into his life. Her laughter, her curiosity, her innocent wonder. But even those moments felt fleeting, like trying to catch sunlight in a jar. Grace, meanwhile, became a shadow in her own home. Her presence was there but barely felt, her footsteps soft and measured, her gaze distant. She spoke when necessary, but her words carried little warmth. She watched Daniel and Violet from a distance, her eyes unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. One evening, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the under-cabinet lights. Her mind swirled with thoughts, heavy and unrelenting. She had tried, hadn't she? Tried to make this work. But every smile Violet offered, every laugh she shared with Daniel, felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She could no longer deny it. She resented the girl. She resented the way Daniel adored her, the way he had shifted his entire world to revolve around this child who didn't belong here. Grace swirled the wine in her glass, her jaw tightening. She wasn't going to let this continue. Not anymore. If Violet were gone, everything could go back to the way it was. Daniel would see her again, love her again, the way he used to. It started as a whisper of an idea, dark and insidious. Grace dismissed it at first, horrified at herself, but the thought kept returning, persistent and tempting. It wasn't as if she hated Violet, not truly. But the girl was an obstacle, a roadblock standing between her and the life she deserved. By the following week, the idea had grown roots. Grace began planning, her mind working through the details carefully, methodically. She couldn't do anything overt. It had to look natural, a tragedy, something no one could question. The opportunity came on an ordinary Thursday evening. Daniel was working late in his office and Violet sat at the kitchen table, coloring. Grace moved through the room with a casual ease, her every action carefully calculated. She offered Violet a snack, a plate of cookies and a glass of milk, her voice unusually soft. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, setting the plate down. "You've been working so hard on your drawings. You deserve a treat." Violet beamed up at her, the innocent joy in her face making Grace's stomach churn. For a moment she hesitated, her hand lingering on the edge of the counter. But the thought of Daniel's distant smiles, his divided attention, hardened her resolve. Violet took a bite of the cookie, her small hands clutching it tightly. Grace watched from the corner of her eye, her chest tight. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. Then it happened. Violet's face paled, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She clutched at her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Grace rushed to her side, her movements deliberate but feigned with urgency. "Violet! Sweetheart, what's wrong?" she cried, her voice laced with mock concern. The little girl couldn't answer. Her tiny body slumped forward, and Grace caught her just before she hit the floor. When Daniel found them, Grace was cradling Violet in her arms, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know what happened," she sobbed, her voice trembling. She just collapsed." Daniel's heart shattered in that instant. He took Violet from her arms, his own trembling as he carried her to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the world outside the windows reduced to streaks of light and shadow. But it was too late. The doctors told him her heart had simply given out. They called it a tragic, unexpected failure, one of those rare and unexplainable things. Daniel could barely hear their words. His mind was stuck on the sight of Violet's small, lifeless body, her once bright eyes now closed forever. Grace took control of the arrangements, her efficiency a stark contrast to Daniel's dazed grief. She insisted on a quick funeral, saying it was best to let Violet rest and allow them to begin the process of healing. "She deserves peace, Daniel," she said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "And so do we." Daniel could only nod, his mind too clouded by sorrow to question her. The funeral was small and somber. Violet was buried with her favorite doll, the one Daniel had given her on her last birthday. He stood by the graveside long after everyone else had left, his heart heavy with memories of her laughter, her tiny hand in his, her soft voice calling him Daddy. The house was suffocating in its stillness. Daniel sat in the darkened living room, his phone heavy in his hand. He had no intention of sleeping, not tonight, not with Violet gone. The weight of grief pressed down on him, dragging his thoughts to places he didn't want to go. He stared at the flickering screen of his phone, a faint reflection of his hollow expression staring back at him. His finger hovered over the app's icon, the one connected to the hidden camera in Violet's doll. It was a gift he'd bought to keep her safe, to watch over her when he couldn't. "Just one last look," he whispered to himself. His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. Just to remember her. The app loaded slowly, the spinning wheel on the screen matching the racing of his heart. The feed came into focus, dim and grainy, but clear enough to make his breath hitch. The camera captured only darkness at first, broken by faint, blurry movements. Then he saw her. Violet. She was alive. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. His daughter was moving inside the coffin, clawing at the sides, her tiny hands beating against the wood. Her face, pale and tear-streaked, was lit by the faint glow of the camera. Her lips trembled as she screamed, though no sound reached him. "Daddy, help me!" The words seemed to echo in his mind, though he couldn't hear them. His stomach twisted as he watched her fragile body fight against the suffocating darkness. "Dear God," Daniel choked, his voice trembling as he stumbled to his feet. His phone slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud, but he didn't stop to pick it up. He grabbed his car keys and bolted out the door, his mind racing faster than his feet. The drive to the cemetery was a blur. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The streets, empty and quiet at this late hour, seemed to stretch on endlessly. When he arrived, he didn't hesitate. The shovel was still in the trunk of his car, a leftover from the burial preparations. He grabbed it and ran to the gravesite, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mound of freshly packed earth loomed before him, mocking him. Every instinct screamed at him to hurry, but his body was slow, clumsy with panic. He dug into the soil with wild, frantic thrusts of the shovel, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hold on, Violet," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I'm coming, baby. Daddy's coming." The dirt gave way inch by inch, and the wooden coffin finally emerged beneath the disturbed earth. He dropped the shovel, his hands clawing at the remaining soil until the lid was fully exposed. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding so hard it felt as if it might burst. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the coffin lid. With one last surge of desperate strength, he pried it open. Violet lay inside, clutching her doll tightly against her chest. Tears streaked her face, and her eyes widened in recognition when she saw him. "Daddy!" she sobbed, her voice hoarse and weak. Daniel scooped her up into his arms, holding her close as her small body trembled against his. "I've got you," he whispered, his own tears streaming freely now. "I've got you, baby. You're safe." Her tiny hands clung to him, as if she were afraid he might vanish. "It was so dark," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. "I was so scared." He kissed the top of her head, his own fear and anger threatening to consume him. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry I let this happen." The drive to the hospital was agonizing, every second feeling like an eternity. Daniel cradled Violet in the passenger seat, keeping his eyes on the road but glancing at her every chance he got. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her small frame far too still for his liking. When they arrived, the staff moved quickly, rushing her into an exam room. Daniel stood outside, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight as he waited for answers. A doctor finally emerged, his face grim but not hopeless. "She's stable," he said, "but her system shows traces of a toxic substance. We need to run more tests to determine exactly what it was." "Toxic," Daniel repeated, the word hitting him like a physical blow. "You mean she was poisoned?" The doctor nodded solemnly. "That's what it looks like. But we caught it in time. She's a very lucky little girl." Lucky. The word tasted bitter on Daniel's tongue. This wasn't luck, this was something far more sinister. Daniel sat by Violet's hospital bed, his hands trembling as he held her small, fragile fingers. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, each pulse a painful reminder of how close he'd come to losing her. His thoughts were a storm, chaotic and unrelenting, But one truth cut through the noise with brutal clarity. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to kill his daughter, and that someone was Grace. The nurse came in quietly to check Violet's vitals, offering Daniel a sympathetic smile. He barely noticed. His focus remained on Violet's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes evidence of her ordeal. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice faint but steady. Daniel leaned closer, brushing her hair back gently. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe now." Violet's gaze darted around the room, her small brow furrowing. "Where's Mommy?" Daniel stiffened, the question twisting in his chest like a knife. "Mommy's at home," he said carefully. "She doesn't know you're here yet." Violet looked up at him, her eyes wide and glistening. "Daddy, Mommy gave me the cookies." His breath hitched. "The cookies?" he asked, his voice low and calm despite the fire building in his chest. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his. "She said they were special, but after I ate one, my tummy started hurting. I told her, but she just said I needed to rest." Daniel's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. "It's okay, baby," he said finally, his voice shaking. "You don't have to say anything else. Daddy will take care of it." The confirmation from Violet was all Daniel needed. The pieces were falling into place, and each one painted an uglier picture of Grace than the last. Her insistence on a quick funeral, her crocodile tears, the way she'd cradled Violet's lifeless body, as if she weren't the one responsible for putting her there. It all made sense now. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He pressed a kiss to Violet's forehead, his resolve hardening. "Rest now," he said softly. "I'll be back soon." Violet's small hand clung to his briefly before letting go. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I love you too, sweetheart," he replied, his voice breaking slightly. Daniel paced the hospital hallway, his fists clenched at his sides. The doctor approached again, this time holding a clipboard. "We've completed the additional tests," the doctor said. "The substance in her system was a slow-acting toxin likely ingested through food or drink. We've stabilized her, but it's clear this was intentional." Daniel's jaw tightened. He nodded curtly, his mind racing. "Thank you, Doctor. Please make sure she's safe while I'm gone." The doctor gave him a puzzled look but didn't press further. Daniel drove home with a singular focus, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Grace's betrayal burned in his chest, a fire fueled by anger and disbelief. How could the woman he once loved, the mother of his adopted daughter, do something so monstrous? When he arrived, the house was quiet. Grace was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine as if nothing had happened. She turned when she heard the door open, her face lighting up with feigned surprise. "Daniel, I didn't expect you back so soon. How's work?" He stood in the doorway, his eyes boring into hers. "Work's fine," he said flatly. "How about you, Grace? How's your day been?" She blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "Oh, the usual. I was just thinking about Violet. It's been hard adjusting without her." Daniel took a step closer, his expression darkening. "Adjusting? Is that what you call it?" Grace tilted her head, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, slamming it onto the counter in front of her. It was the toxicology report. "Explain this," he said coldly. Grace's eyes flickered over the paper, her face carefully blank. "I don't understand." "Don't lie to me!" Daniel roared, his voice echoing through the house. "She told me, Grace. Violet told me you gave her those cookies. She told me what you did." For a moment, Grace froze. Then her expression shifted, the mask of innocence slipping away to reveal something colder, sharper. "And what exactly are you accusing me of, Daniel?" she said, her tone calm, but laced with venom. "You tried to kill her," he said, his voice trembling with fury. "You poisoned her and buried her alive. All so you could go back to your perfect little life." Grace smirked, taking another sip of her wine. "You're being dramatic," she said lightly. "It was an accident. You're letting your grief cloud your judgment." Daniel's fists clenched, his entire body trembling with rage. "This isn't grief, Grace. This is clarity. I see you now for what you really are. A monster." Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders. "And what are you going to do about it, Daniel? Who's going to believe you? You think anyone will take the word of a grieving father over mine?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I don't need anyone to believe me. I have proof." Grace's confidence cracked, her composure slipping as the weight of his words sank in. She set the wine glass down, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Daniel said, his voice ice-cold. "And I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Grace stared at him, her eyes narrowing as fear and defiance warred within her. For the first time, she realized she'd underestimated him. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, shattering the tense silence that had settled over the kitchen. Grace's head snapped toward the noise, her eyes widening as Daniel stepped into the room, Violet clinging to his side. The little girl's pale face lit up the moment she spotted Grace, her instinctive need for love and connection pushing her toward her adoptive mother. "Mummy!" Violet's soft voice was a stark contrast to the cold, heavy atmosphere. She took a tentative step forward, her small hand still clutching Daniel's. Grace's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her gaze flicked between Violet and Daniel, panic flickering behind her carefully maintained facade. "Violet, you're alive?" Her voice trembled, but it wasn't with relief. Daniel stepped in front of Violet, his posture protective, his expression as hard as stone. "She's alive," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "No thanks to you." Grace's face twisted into a mask of confusion, her hands fluttering nervously at her sides. "What are you talking about? Of course I'm glad she's alive. I thought she was gone. I mourned her, Daniel. We both did." "You didn't mourn her," Daniel spat, his voice rising. "You buried her alive." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb about to detonate. Grace staggered back a step, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "That's insane," she said, shaking her head violently. "I would never." "Daniel, you can't seriously believe that. Don't lie to me." His shout cut her off, the raw fury in his voice silencing any protest she might have made. He pulled the toxicology report from his pocket and slammed it onto the counter. "This doesn't lie. Violet doesn't lie. You gave her those cookies, Grace. You poisoned her and left her to die." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. She stared at the paper as if it might suddenly erase the damning evidence. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean..." Didn't mean to what? Daniel interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. Didn't mean to kill her? Didn't mean to bury her alive? What, Grace? What exactly didn't you mean to do? Her composure shattered and tears welled up in her eyes. I just wanted things to go back to how they were, she cried. Before her, before everything changed. You don't see it, Daniel, but you forgot about me the moment she came into our lives. I was trying to save us. Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable, his silence more damning than any words. Violet peeked out from behind him, her small voice trembling as she asked, Mommy, why did you want to hurt me? The question struck like a hammer. Grace's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. I didn't mean to hurt you, she sobbed. I didn't know what else to do. Daniel crouched down, pulling Violet into his arms. He stroked her hair gently, his heart breaking at the confusion and pain in her innocent eyes. It's okay, sweetheart, he murmured. You don't have to listen to her anymore. You're safe now. When he straightened, his gaze locked on Grace with an intensity that made her flinch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, slapping it onto the counter next to the toxicology report. What's that? Grace asked, her voice hollow. Divorce papers, Daniel said simply. I've had them ready for months, hoping I wouldn't have to use them. But after this... He shook his head, disgust etched into every line of his face. There's nothing left to save. Grace's face crumpled as the weight of his words sank in. Daniel, please, she begged, reaching out toward him. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever you want. Therapy, counseling. Just don't give up on me. I gave you every chance, Daniel said, his voice steady but cold. And you threw them all away. You didn't just give up on me, Grace. You gave up on her. He nodded toward Violet, who was watching the exchange with wide, wary eyes. I'll never forgive you for that. Grace sat frozen as Daniel turned and walked away, Violet nestled securely in his arms. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the house, each one carrying him further from her. When the front door closed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Grace felt the full weight of her actions. She had underestimated Daniel, convinced herself he would never stand up to her, that he would always forgive. But now, as she sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, she realized she had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her carefully curated life. And most painfully, she had lost the chance to truly be a mother to Violet. Daniel adjusted the picture frame on the mantel, his hand lingering on the edge of the wooden frame. It was a photograph of Violet, taken just a week ago, her shy smile lighting up the image. The bruises of the past still lingered in their lives, but slowly the scars were fading, replaced by something brighter, something hopeful. Violet was in the corner of the room, her crayons spread out on the coffee table as she worked intently on a drawing. She hummed softly under her breath, her small voice filling the quiet house with a warmth Daniel hadn't felt in years. He glanced over, watching her little hands at work, and felt a swell of pride. You okay, sweetheart? He asked gently. She looked up and nodded, her face brightening. I'm making a picture for you, Daddy. Daniel smiled. Can't wait to see it. The days after Grace's departure had been hard, but they'd also been freeing. The house, once a place of tension and unspoken resentments, now felt lighter. Daniel poured all his energy into making Violet feel safe and loved, and in return, she blossomed in ways he hadn't thought possible. At first, she was hesitant, her steps careful, her laughter subdued. But as the weeks passed, her confidence grew. She began to run through the house with unrestrained joy, her giggles echoing through the halls. Daniel found himself laughing along with her, rediscovering a part of himself he thought had been lost forever. One afternoon they planted flowers in the small garden out back. Violet insisted on bright colors: sunflowers, daisies, and marigolds. She crouched beside Daniel, her hands buried in the soil as she chattered about how the flowers would grow tall and strong if they gave them enough love. "Like me," she said suddenly, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Exactly like you," he said softly. Moments like these reminded him of how fragile and resilient Violet was. She'd been through so much, yet she still had an open heart, ready to love and be loved. Meanwhile, Grace's absence hung over the house like a ghost, not for what she'd been, but for what she'd taken. Daniel thought about her occasionally, not with longing, but with a deep, simmering anger. He'd done everything he could for her, given her every chance to be a part of their family, and she had thrown it all away. She had tried to contact him once, through a letter she'd sent to his office. The words were full of apologies, promises to change, but Daniel hadn't even finished reading it. He'd shredded the letter and thrown it in the trash. Grace was his past, and he had no intention of letting her poison his or Violet's future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel and Violet sat on the porch swing together. She leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, her tiny fingers clutching a stuffed bear he'd bought her to replace the one lost during her ordeal. "Daddy," she said quietly. "Yeah, baby? Do you think Mommy misses us?" Daniel took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. I think she misses the idea of us," he said finally. "But sometimes people don't know how to take care of the things they love." Violet was silent for a long moment, her small face thoughtful. "I'm glad I have you," she said finally, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. Danielle's heart swelled, and he pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm glad I have you too, sweetheart." Over time, their life began to feel normal, even happy. Daniel found joy in the simple routines, making Violet breakfast before school, helping her with her homework, tucking her in at night with a story. She thrived under his care, her laughter becoming a constant in their home. They celebrated her 5th birthday with a small party in the backyard. Violet wore a bright yellow dress and twirled around the garden as Daniel snapped pictures, her smile brighter than the sunflowers they had planted together. "Make a wish," he said as she blew out the candles on her cake. She closed her eyes tightly, her face scrunched in concentration, and then blew out the flames in one breath. When she opened her eyes, she giggled. "What did you wish for?" Daniel asked, his voice teasing. "I can't tell you, or it won't come true," she replied, grinning. Years passed, and Violet grew into a smart, kind-hearted young woman. The shadows of her early years faded into distant memories, replaced by the warmth of a life filled with love and care. She excelled in school, her teachers praising her creativity and resilience. Daniel watched her with pride, knowing he had done his best to give her a good life. He often thought about how far they had come, how much they had overcome together. One day, as they sat together in the garden, Violet looked at him and said, "You know, Daddy, you saved me, not just from what happened, but from everything. You made me feel safe." Daniel's chest tightened, and he reached out to take her hand. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. you saved me. The story of Daniel and Violet is a poignant journey of resilience, love, and redemption that deeply resonates with readers. Daniel's transformation from a man blinded by his unwavering devotion to a toxic relationship into a steadfast protector and loving father is both heartbreaking and inspiring. His strength in the face of betrayal and his unwavering commitment to Violet highlights the profound impact of selfless love and courage in overcoming even the darkest of trials. Violet's journey is equally touching. Despite her tender age and the immense trauma she endures, her innocence and capacity to trust again showcase the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Together, Daniel and Violet rebuild a life filled with warmth and joy, proving that family is not defined by blood, but by love and care. The story underscores the importance of recognizing toxic relationships and having the courage to protect what truly matters. It reminds us that even amidst betrayal and loss, the bonds of genuine love can heal and nurture. The narrative is a testament to the power of redemption, the beauty of second chances, and the unyielding strength of a parent's love, leaving readers with a profound appreciation for the resilience of the human heart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.